Dawn over the Philippine Sea came up like a radio, warming from a whisper to a hum. First the horizon glowing pewter, then a lattice of contrails and heat haze pricking the sky where it met water as flat as a chart. On Task Force 58's picket ring, a destroyer's radar dish turned its measured circles, the air search set clicking softly in a rhythm the watchstanders could feel in their teeth. Far to the west, beyond that clean horizon, a different rhythm assembled itself on the decks of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carriers. Flight crews rolled torpedoes into slings, armorers snapped metal against metal, chocks thumped. Overkill, Japanese aviators had been promising each other since the spring, smiling in briefings with the confidence of men who assumed American power was theatrical. Loud, heavy, wasteful, and, with enough finesse, evadable. They cannot fill the sky with airplanes all day, a flight leader had said the night before, tapping a cigarette on a deck rail. And if they try, we will teach them humility the way a blade teaches cloth. Before noon on June 19, 1944, the cloth learned to resist the blade. It began with a voice inside a combat information center, level and unhurried. New group bearing 270, range 150, Angels 15, course east. The plotters traced green grease pencil arcs on the board. A fighter director standing under a red lamp steadied his headset and answered with a sentence that would repeat 100 times before the day retired. Vector 280, climb, Angels 20. On the flight deck, F6F Hellcats came up on the catwalks with a sound like a hive finding its purpose. Pilots strapped in without hurry because there is a kind of rush that produces mistakes and a different kind that produces results, and Task Force 58 had drilled the difference into muscle memory. When the deck crews waved them forward, the planes leapt into air that was already theirs, but insisted on being earned again each minute. The Japanese scouts found ships, yes, smudges of wakes and steel angles that glinted when sun and sea conspired. But before their strike groups could convert sightings into kills, they entered a corridor designed by strangers. Picket radars caught the raiders far out, dispassionately. Bearings became vectors, vectors became altitude calls, altitude became a layered wall of fighters stacked in disciplined shells above the fleet. Calm voices laced the shells into nets. Bogey 270, Angels 25, heading 090. Roger. Wolfpack 1 from Saratoga, turn port. Wolfpack 2, hold Angels 30. Do not descend. Repeat, do not descend. The tone was not cinematic. It was domestic, like instructions at a crowded dinner table. Pass the salt, hold your glass, wait your turn. And the effect was ruthless. Hellcats rolled off sun lines with surplus energy. Zeros and Judy dive bombers that had been counting seconds to their push felt seconds become knives. Gun camera film would later show the math in bright, detached clarity. The longer tracer that marks a 50 caliber burst walking into a cockpit frame, the brittle fracture of a canopy, a wing shrugging loose at its root, and the brief, wild angle of a falling airplane, surprised that air can punish as well as support. One Japanese pilot would remember later that the first ambush felt like flying into a bayonet rack you had sworn wasn't there. He saw a blue shape grow 3 sizes across his world in the space of 2 breaths. Then his wingman's wing was a hinge instead of a wing, and the sky, which should be open, was somehow clogged with American machines. They counted us, he wrote in a calmer decade. before we could count ourselves. Counting was the day's secret. Not heroism, though there was enough of that to fill 10 metal parks. Not hatred, though there was enough of that to warm a cold cabin. Counting. Counting radar sweeps. Counting minutes until Hellcats must cycle for gas and ammunition. Counting bearing lines. Counting angels. If Ozawa's air arm had once won by intuition and speed, by elan that made young men brave for the living and easy about the dying, the edge now belonged to arithmetic spoken softly into headphones. Within an hour, the first wave lost its name. It ceased to be a coherent strike and became bright individual decisions made under duress. Pull now, jettison now, climb if the engine will give you another 100 feet. Dive if your heart will give you another 100 knots. The fighter directors were careful where the raiders could not afford to be. They refused to let altitude collapse into a dogfight. They refused to spend their last knots low over the ships, merely to satisfy a sense of chivalry that the enemy would happily neglect. "Hold the stack," someone said inside a CIC, whose air smelled of pencil shavings and sweat. "Make them climb to us." And the raids climbed and were peeled, one by one, each peeled element becoming a story that would never finish its next sentence. In the span of hours, pilots in Task Force 58 claimed roughly 380 aircraft, a figure that historians would match against harder counts later, but an honest index of what pilots felt as they reset their gun sights and found another silhouette to solve. The great phrase, Marianas Turkey Shoot, would sprout from the chap's tent with the sardonic confidence of men who have lived and mean to make the living fit a human frame. While the sky fought, the sea worked. Submarines, boats men often forget because they hunt unseen, unspooled their own chapters. USS Albacore found Taihō and did a single careful thing at high cost. One torpedo, placed such that engineering would later fill notebooks with shock patterns, and men would later refuse to discuss the details with anyone who had not smelled fuel vapor. Taihō's damage would teach a lesson about discipline in crisis that her crew did not have time to learn well enough. Hours later, USS Cavalla found Shōkaku, and when she drove her torpedoes home, the ocean wrote a page in fire and smoke so large even the men too busy to look up felt it in the way the horizon changed color. The sun lowered, and the ledger became cruel. 2 of Japan's big carriers gone or mortally wounded by nightfall, the light carrier Hiyō to follow the next day. None of those wounds were inflicted by jokes about American overkill. They were inflicted by a system that put metal and men where they had to be and kept them supplied with the seconds in which courage could do its work. By late afternoon, the word vanished became the only word that fit a phenomenon otherwise too large for humane prose. Nearly 400 planes were not shot down in a filmic sense, each watched to the waterline by a camera and a witness with time for eloquence. They were removed from the day, destroyed in fractions, disassembled by geometry and discipline. Some never reached the intercept boxes because picket radars found them early enough to set the pace. Some reached the boxes and died there, their last view a windscreen full of American fuselage. Some punched through and found flak cones over the carriers that bit the word accuracy into ribbons. Others were land-based reinforcements from Guam and nearby islands that had practiced attacking a fleet painted on a chart and discovered that charts do not vector Hellcats into your path. Claims would be sorted later. Task Force 58's confidence against the accounting that would harden into about 550 to 645 aircraft over the two-day battle. But the day's felt truth remains. A nation that had bet on speed and surprise met a nation that had invested in radar, radios, and replacement pilots. And the bet failed. Loss, counted in machines, is big. Loss, counted in men, is irrevocable. Japanese aircrew rotation had been a proud thing when the empire spread like spilled ink across the map. Veterans stayed where their hands could teach younger hands, but the replacements never kept pace with the tempo of battle. Now the veteran corps burned away in a series of minutes that looked ordinary on wall clocks. The Americans lost too, 123 aircraft, 109 personnel, and if you need an honest nuance to respect, know that many losses did not occur in combat, but in a hardest kind of courage. The night recovery that began after the mission of mercy, when Halsey's and Spruance's men tried to bring every plane home in darkening weather, on decks heaving with duty and fuel fumes, with LSO paddles carving ellipses and pilots flying on nerves and ghosted instrument lights. In that hour, the sea kept some, and returned some, and the men who returned slept with their boots still on, until hands shook them awake to fly again. If the day had a single sentence that explains its harsh arithmetic, it is this: the U.S. Navy learned to make time, and the Japanese Navy could no longer afford to buy it. Time is altitude stacked. Angels 2-0, Angels 2-8, Angels 3-2. Time is an early radar return that gives you 15 extra minutes of climb. Time is a voice on the net that doesn't crowd the ether with fear. Time is a deck crew who turn a flight deck into a metronome, launching, recovering, rearming, relaunching on a beat no enemy could interrupt from the outside. Time is pilot training measured not in the brilliance of one ace, but in the competence of 100 men who can fly the plan they're given. And in a war where metal could be made fast but men could not, competence beat brilliance that had no heirs. Japanese briefings the week before had rehearsed a different reality. Charts pinned to corkboards in the ready rooms aboard Zuikaku and other carriers suggested a strike geometry in which searchers found the Americans and massed groups pounced on a distracted cap, slipping through while the enemy chased false vectors and wasted altitude in chivalrous dogfighting. The projection assumed Americans would radiate confusion as soon as the first alarm sounded. It also assumed American sets were clumsy or fragile. In truth, destroyer pickets with SG and SC radars had learned to pull faint flocks out of static, like a violinist coaxing melody from a poor instrument. Control teams in the carrier's CICs had drilled the nearly impolite skill of cutting pilots off mid-sentence to prevent wasted words. Say angels only. Say course only, a controller had told a new team a week earlier, and after the first morning sweep on June 19th, you could hear that lesson living inside every transmission. When the first Japanese wave bearings came alive on the plot, controllers spoke in clipped pieces that left no confusion. Turn starboard, heading 285, Angels 26, Buster. Pilots expected brevity, delivered obedience, and the corridor that Japanese aviators had hoped to discover by art or luck simply would not open. From the Hellcat cockpit, the world on June 19th was bright, hot, and surprisingly quiet until it wasn't. The engine's leash pulled against the harness as the pilot eased into a high cover position. Below, the fleet stacked into an orderly geometry. Small ships fast and far, big ships slower and centered, each throwing up patterns of black puffs that looked almost lazy from Angel's 3-0. The pilot listened to calm men thread him across the map. Wolfpack 1, break now. Break right 20 degrees, bogey 2 o'clock, Angels 27. The pilot didn't answer because answers are waste when the answer is action. He rolled, felt the G find his ribs, found the silhouette that matched the training cards he'd held in ready rooms from Pensacola to Pearl. He climbed in the merge because control said, hold the top, and his left hand knew the throttle, and his right hand knew the trigger point the way a boxer knows a friend's shoulder. The Japanese aviator he chased saw him at the last second and did the brave, obvious thing, pulled into him. But the obvious thing failed against a man with 100 hours of gunnery practice and a nose-mounted sight drilled into his eye line by repetition. 3 taps on the trigger walked light into the other cockpit. Canvas blew out first, metal second. The pilot tracked through the fall because the day had no time for admiration. Down on the American decks, airplan officers ran a tempo that would have embarrassed a metronome. A launch cycle looks like chaos to the untrained eye. To a sense schooled by months of practice, it looks like grace-wearing boots. Ordnancemen brought fused bombs from magazines where heat made the air heavy to breathe. The men hauled the bombs with the stiff, cooperative silence of a factory that understands penalties for error. Armorers checked racks and belts, and then checked them again, because an F6F that arrives on a vector with dead guns is a story without an ending. Yellow shirt directors flicked wrists, and the airplanes obeyed like hunters' dogs. Come, heel, go. Crash crews crouched at the edge with axes and foam like an audience that prays for boredom and prepares for theater. When a group trapped, all hands tasted the same impatience that the pilots felt in their wrists. Get them stopped, turned, topped off, and gone. Tiny increments mattered. A minute saved on one deck could be 10 more Hellcats stacked at altitude before the next wave reached radar range. If naval aviation is a bellows, the man whose hand pumps it never forgets that oxygen keeps flame honest, and passing air at the right moment is the difference between warmth and burn. On the Japanese side, courage could still look like skill when viewed from a foot away, and for a minute in the middle of the day, some raiders found gaps, or seemed to. A few D4Y Judies pushed through flak shadows to press shallow dives at the American carriers, and a few TBF torpedo tracks stirred wakes like snakes, looking for a reason to be described. But gaps that open in a well-managed cap are traps more often than tunnels. The intercept boxes refresh in layers, like waves in disciplined sequence. One pilot who broke a formation to chase a quail of a target discovered that radio discipline can summon a friend you didn't know existed. "Hold the top," a voice snapped in his ear. Not angry, exactly, but as firm as a father. He zoomed back to altitude in time to cover a friend whose tail had grown a 0. Later, at debrief, he would scratch a note on the form, "Discipline saved me," and the intelligence officer would underline it twice because that sentence is as useful to a war as pictures of wreckage. Japanese pilots who had trained in a doctrine that rewarded initiative now discovered that initiative without support was simply exposure. A man cannot turn courage into a result if the geometry removes all the corners where courage belongs. Guam and the Marshals offered the day a set of reinforcements that had rehearsed another story entirely. Land-based units scrambled into air that they had believed would be empty for the first 100 miles. Their flight leaders carried the honest belief that a fleet hidden among miles of ocean will be hard to find and harder to channel. But the pickets heard again. Bearings crawled inward, like hands around a bowl. Mitcher's fighter directors borrowed the same tools they were using against carrier waves and poured them onto the land-based approach lanes. A pilot from Guam later wrote that he never saw the fleet, only the Americans. "They appeared above us like the roof of a barn that has fallen down," he wrote, a line that reads like poetry only when you do not have to fly under it. His wingman did not return. His superior did not return. Of the many pilots who had launched with local pride burning and engine oil warm, barely a handful found beaches again. Those who did found their fields cratered, their crews stunned, and their commanders asking for a second wave, as if willpower alone could conjure fuel and ammunition. The truth that day was simpler. The sky had become a gate that only one side could open. Meanwhile, under the horizon where the sky's plot seemed distant, sub-commanders sweated through pages of calm. Albacore's approach to Taihō was an exercise in patience so strict it looked like immobility to an untrained eye. Soundmen called bearings, numbers in whisper tones that never wavered because wavering introduces doubt, and doubt vibrates into mistakes. The skipper chose a single torpedo with the kind of conviction that looks reckless until the post-war charts reveal how right it was. When a torpedo strikes a carrier full of volatile fuel-air mixtures, the ship's story is written half by steel and half by chemistry. Taihō breathed her last in chapters: hit, damage control, hope, then a fatal decision that turned fumes into catastrophe. Cavalla's accounting with Shōkaku was less ambiguous. Multiple hits, fire running forward like a journalist in a crowd, and then the sea closing a clean circle where a great ship had been. In the flag plot aboard an American carrier, the markers moved. There is a formality to moving a carrier's marker to a different corner of the board. No one cheers. They sharpen pencils and make the new truth useful. By mid-afternoon, fighter pilots returning from interceptions were surprised by how light their hands felt on the throttles. Lightness of hand is not joy, it is saturation. Many had fired a pass, reset, fired another, and then flown escort for a group that did not need escorting, because the enemy, who had promised mass, produced stragglers. Debrief rooms filled with quick, precise sentences. Initial tally 10 to 12 zeros, Angels 2-4, own Angels 2-8. Fired from 100 yards, deflection 20 degrees. Observed hits canopy and wing root. No shoot. Intelligence officers scribbled and asked for numbers a second time, because the numbers had their own gravity and would be weighed later against photographs, radar logs, and surviving fragments. Claims reached toward 400. Even now, reading, you can feel the slight guilt good men feel when reality stretches to fit numbers that feel indecent. That guilt is not apology. It is a sign of men taught to respect proof. On the American ships, radios that had carried the day's perfect violence now carried something more dangerous: silence with a purpose. As evening settled, many aircraft had been flung far afield, hunting across a sunset that the Admiralty would later wish had come an hour later. The mission of mercy began, a phrase without sarcasm that tasted like coffee burned at the edges. Pilots came home in staggered, ragged streams, LSO paddles carved light into the dark. Deck crews lit what they could light without inviting torpedoes. In at least one cockpit, a pilot flew without fuel enough to be precious about pattern and spent his last gallon on courage. Another flew with a wounded wingman tucked to his hip like a package. A third flew with instruments half dead and a throat raw from calling a tail number that did not answer. Some of those men survived because the deck crews made seconds. Some were lost because the sea is still the sea. The price line in the ledger. 123 U.S. Aircraft 109 personnel finds much of its ink in this hour when discipline and compassion tried to coexist within night's narrow margins. Context makes the day's figures instructive rather than merely spectacular. In 2 days, Japan lost on the order of 550 to 645 aircraft. The one-day feeling of 400 vanished lives in the American pilot claims and in the actual collapse of raiding groups that never reassembled into coherent units. Post-war accounting cleaves sensation from certainty without erasing either. What cannot be split is the attrition of crews. Planes can be rebuilt. Men who can use them as scalpel and shield cannot be minted with the speed metal obeys. Japan's training pipelines, thinned by the drawdown after Midway and starved by fuel constraints and the urgent demands of a sprawling war, could not fit a hand to each new stick. America's could. Industrial-scale pilot training is not a romantic phrase, but it describes a romance with competence that feeds itself. Every young American who joined on June 19th could fit instantly into a geometry designed for him. Every young Japanese who might have replaced a loss that day would have required a decade of luck that no nation gets for free. If you strip away the adjectives, what remains are the systems. Radar that did not overpromise or underperform, but simply worked, painting approach arcs far enough out for voice controllers to pull levers that pilots could obey. Radios that did not commit treason when the weather warmed, that carried calm speech without stutter, that made discipline a communal act. Carrier decks that rotated sorties like a carousel in a city built by engineers. A rhythm so steady it felt smug, until you compared it with the halt-jerk tempo of an enemy trying to be elegant with a dwindling budget. Oilers and ordnance ships and tenders that sat out of sight and made the visible parts of the war plausible, a doctrine that told men the top of the stack is a kind of courage, that not chasing a single target is sometimes braver than chasing, that staying a few thousand feet higher than your zeal demands is how you save friends you cannot see. If you want to know why mockery turns to silence in a single afternoon, write those nouns on a board and draw arrows between them, and then ask the arrows to sing. For Japanese pilots who survived, the day entered memory as a kind of echo that changed the shape of later rooms. One remembered the sudden discovery that American 50s did not have to be fired in great gusts to be cruel. A half-second was a paragraph. Another remembered a Hellcat's nose that did not rise like the nose of his Zero in a steep turn. It held, it bit, it refused to bleed energy as expected, and so the duel was not a duel, but a formality. Another remembered a radio that seemed to be everywhere at once, an omnipresence that made his own orders feel like suggestions to himself. The pride of the pre-war elite survived only as a private ache. The new reality was that a pilot was a component, not a hero who could bend a battle by will. Japan had created heroes and run out. America had created competence and made more. Many Americans will forever remember June 19th for the photographs and for the phrase that sounds flippant if you read it wrong. Turkey Shoot is soldiers' humor, a way to drag horror into a frame small enough to carry in public. In private, men spoke more carefully. One wrote that the sky looked crowded with endings. Another wrote that it felt like dismantling something that had once been beautiful and had now chosen to be useful against us. The war did not always allow respect for the enemy to breathe. June 19th did. Pilots who trapped that night spoke softly of the men they had killed, not because their remorse was larger than their duty, but because duty had been so efficiently served that only the human aftertaste remained. The next morning, those same men rolled for a pursuit mission because the sea writes sequels before you have caught your breath from the first book. Admiral Spruance, sometimes maligned by armchair admirals for caution, wrote the day as a victory in the language he prefers, orderly, precise, devoid of show. Mitcher, whose decks had a personality this day, carried into the night a willingness to spend men to save men that would confuse lesser commanders and comfort the ones under his flag. Halsey, elsewhere, would later own other days with louder grammar. Here, between radar sweeps and fighter vectors and torpedo wakes, stitched by submarines whose names most citizens forget, the American way of war tilted irreversibly toward systems and away from single stars. The flag plot's greased arcs hardened into after-action reports and then into training syllabi, and men not yet born would learn June 19th not as folklore, but as procedure: how to stack a cap, how to hold altitude in the face of temptation, how to land at night when compassion asks you to violate every rule you were taught, and you do, and you live, and you sleep badly for a week, but grateful. One small voice deserves a last word: the LSO on a deck that traps in bad light. He stands with paddles or with lighted bats in later decades, knees slightly bent, back unconsciously aligned with the pitching deck, shouting words that are half ritual, half rescue. Little power, hold your nose up, come left, Roger, cut. He is the last calm voice a man hears in a day dense with noise. When June 19th tipped into night, LSOs with cracked lips and strained thighs stole men from the sea one at a time. You will not find their names on a list of aces. You will find them on a list of men whose colleagues owe birthdays to a stranger's wrists. Their work belongs with radar and radios in any honest hymn to the systems that turned mockery into math. The morning after, Japanese fleet staff who had argued for an afternoon of audacity stared at boards where squadron names no longer had pilots to wear them. They could still write orders. They could not summon competence out of the air. Metal could be made ready. Air wings could not. For an enemy who had once taught the Pacific to fear the sharp edge of a carrier strike, the discovery was more than tactical. It was existential. The carrier versus carrier war was over. They just did not know how to pronounce the period yet. Within a year, when the greatest armada ever assembled would stand off beaches named for letters and colors, the lesson of June 19th would unfurl itself across 500 miles of ocean. Mass not for its own sake, but because mass makes time. Discipline not as a mood, but as a technique. Technology not as a fetish, but as a translator between human will and the sky's indifference. To watch the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot only through gun sights is to miss half of it. Stand instead in a radar room as a new sweep paints a faint arc, and a petty officer with a pencil adds range rings in chalk. Stand in a VF ready room where a senior pilot uses his hands to show a junior the difference between a pure and a lag pursuit. Stand on a submarine's bridge with a skipper calculating speed across an open angle while his own heart paddles harder. Stand on a deck with a bosun's mate who can feel when the ship wants to roll and clips a chalk line 2 inches left to save a man's foot. The day belongs to all of them, the anonymous edges that make clean centerpieces possible. If you insist on heroes, and the species always will, then make your hero the quiet sentence said 1,000 times. Vector 280, Angels 25, do not descend. Numbers, the day after, acquire their steadier meanings. When the intel section collects claims and subtracts double counts and reconciles with wreckage and with Japanese records dug from post-war archives, they still write a number whose mass bends sentences. On the order of 550 TX-45 Japanese aircraft lost across June 1920. Carriers struck and sunk, airfields left with the sound of empty wind. American losses small by comparison and still heavy in the rooms where the missing lived. Each number is a grave and a factory note both. For the Japanese, each is a pilot whose chair cannot be filled. For the Americans, each is a reminder that systems cannot prevent all sorrow, only concentrate it where it buys the most safety. Men who studied the day later would argue over whether 400 vanished fits honesty. The pilots who flew it would shrug and point at the afternoon light. So many shapes came, so few went. If language cannot hold that, it is language that must stretch, not memory. Industrial reach lurks behind every detailed account of June 19th, like a bass line behind a melody. Pilot training pipelines at Jacksonville and Corpus Christi fed the fleet with men who did not need to invent tactics on arrival. Maintenance chains shipped spares that meant a minor hit made a long repair instead of a permanent eulogy. Oilers refueled task groups at a tempo that let admirals choose where to be brave. Against this, Japan placed courage, craft, and history. History has gravity, but no engines. Courage has engines, but no fuel if a nation runs dry. Craft matters immensely until the other side manufactures enough craft to make individual haunting irrelevant. When Japanese pilots mocked American overkill, they assumed excess was self-defeating. On June 19th, they learned excess can be the shortest distance between possibility and result. So the sentence stands, nearly 400 planes vanished in a day. Not a magical disappearance, but a series of competent subtractions done faster than the enemy could measure. In every subtraction is a man with a headset guiding a man with a gun sight, a line on a plot intercepting a line in the sky, a deck crew pushing a plane into wind, a boat captain drawing a line in grease pencil under a red light, a sailor counting seconds until the paddles drop. June 19th is the textbook proof in the long argument of the Pacific War, the day technology and training acquired the moral authority usually reserved for gallantry. The men were gallant. But what saved more of them than gallantry ever could was a cool insistence that doctrine be learned until doctrine can improvise itself. What remains, when the smoke moves outward and the sea flattens back into its old privacy, is the sound of method. It is quiet enough to be mistaken for mercy. It is not mercy. It is the decision, made far from battle, to overbuild radios and overtrain pilots and overstock fuel and overpractice the phrases that matter. It is the refusal to let any one man's talent be the hinge of a nation's hope. Japanese pilots who mocked that as overkill met an afternoon in which overkill disguised itself as inevitability. The wall of Hellcats was not a wall at all. It was a schedule, a set of hands, and a patience that had learned to fly. What remains when the smoke moves outward and the sea flattens back into its old privacy is the sound of method. It is quiet enough to be mistaken for mercy. It is not mercy. It is the decision, made far from battle, to overbuild radios and overtrain pilots and overstock fuel and overpractice the phrases that matter. It is the refusal to let any one man's talent be the hinge of a nation's hope. Japanese pilots who mocked that as overkill met an afternoon in which overkill disguised itself as inevitability. The wall of Hellcats was not a wall at all. It was a schedule, a set of hands, and a patience that had learned to fly. What remains when the smoke moves outward and the sea flattens back into its old privacy is the sound of method. It is quiet enough to be mistaken for mercy. It is not mercy. It is the decision, made far from battle, to overbuild radios and overtrain pilots and overstock fuel and overpractice the phrases that matter. It is the refusal to let any one man's talent be the hinge of a nation's hope. Japanese pilots who mocked that as overkill met an afternoon in which overkill disguised itself as inevitability. The wall of Hellcats was not a wall at all. It was a schedule, a set of hands, and a patience that had learned to fly. What remains when the smoke moves outward and the sea flattens back into its old privacy is the sound of method. It is quiet enough to be mistaken for mercy. It is not mercy. It is the decision, made far from battle, to overbuild radios and overtrain pilots and overstock fuel and overpractice the phrases that matter. It is the refusal to let any one man's talent be the hinge of a nation's hope. Japanese pilots who mocked that as overkill met an afternoon in which overkill disguised itself as inevitability. The wall of Hellcats was not a wall at all. It was a schedule, a set of hands, and a patience that had learned to fly. What remains when the smoke moves outward and the sea flattens back into its old privacy is the sound of method. It is quiet enough to be mistaken for mercy. It is not mercy. It is the decision, made far from battle, to overbuild radios and overtrain pilots and overstock fuel and overpractice the phrases that matter. It is the refusal to let any one man's talent be the hinge of a nation's hope. Japanese pilots who mocked that as overkill met an afternoon in which overkill disguised itself as inevitability. The wall of Hellcats was not a wall at all. It was a schedule, a set of hands, and a patience that had learned to fly. What remains when the smoke moves outward and the sea flattens back into its old privacy is the sound of method. It is quiet enough to be mistaken for mercy. It is not mercy. It is the decision, made far from battle, to overbuild radios and overtrain pilots and overstock fuel and overpractice the phrases that matter. It is the refusal to let any one man's talent be the hinge of a nation's hope. Japanese pilots who mocked that as overkill met an afternoon in which overkill disguised itself as inevitability. The wall of Hellcats was not a wall at all. It was a schedule, a set of hands, and a patience that had learned to fly. What remains when the smoke moves outward and the sea flattens back into its old privacy is the sound of method. It is quiet enough to be mistaken for mercy. It is not mercy. It is the decision, made far from battle, to overbuild radios and overtrain pilots and overstock fuel and overpractice the phrases that matter. It is the refusal to let any one man's talent be the hinge of a nation's hope. Japanese pilots who mocked that as overkill met an afternoon in which overkill disguised itself as inevitability. The wall of Hellcats was not a wall at all. It was a schedule, a set of hands, and a patience that had learned to fly. What remains, when the smoke moves outward and the sea flattens back into its old privacy, is the sound of method. It is quiet enough to be mistaken for mercy. It is not mercy. It is the decision, made far from battle, to overbuild radios and overtrain pilots and overstock fuel and overpractice the phrases that matter. It is the refusal to let any one man's talent be the hinge of a nation's hope. Japanese pilots who mocked that as overkill met an afternoon in which overkill disguised itself as inevitability. The wall of Hellcats was not a wall at all. It was a schedule, a set of hands, and a patience that had learned to fly. What remains, when the smoke moves outward and the sea flattens back into its old privacy, is the sound of method. It is quiet enough to be mistaken for mercy. It is not mercy. It is the decision, made far from battle, to overbuild radios and overtrain pilots and overstock fuel and overpractice the phrases that matter. It is the refusal to let any one man's talent be the hinge of a nation's hope. Japanese pilots who mocked that as overkill met an afternoon in which overkill disguised itself as inevitability. The wall of Hellcats was not a wall at all. It was a schedule, a set of hands, and a patience that had learned to fly. What remains, when the smoke moves outward and the sea flattens back into its old privacy, is the sound of method. It is quiet enough to be mistaken for mercy. It is not mercy. It is the decision, made far from battle, to overbuild radios and overtrain pilots and overstock fuel and overpractice the phrases that matter. It is the refusal to let any one man's talent be the hinge of a nation's hope. Japanese pilots who mocked that as overkill met an afternoon in which overkill disguised itself as inevitability. The wall of Hellcats was not a wall at all. It was a schedule, a set of hands, and a patience that had learned to fly.